The snow fell in thick, silent curtains across the Ardennes forest, each flake a small mercy that covered the frozen blood on the ground. Lieutenant Grace Mercer pressed her back against the crumbling stone wall of what had once been a Belgian farmhouse, now serving as a makeshift aid station for the 101st Airborne Division. Her hands, red and raw, despite the thin surgical gloves, trembled as she threaded another suture through the torn flesh of Private Danny Kowalski's shoulder. The boy, and he was a boy, no matter what his draft papers claimed, had stopped screaming an hour ago, which worried her more than the screaming had. "Stay with me, Danny," she whispered, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. The windows had been blown out 3 days earlier during the German artillery barrage, and no amount of blankets or body heat could keep the December cold from seeping into the bones of the wounded men scattered across the floor. "Your mother's waiting for you in Pittsburgh. You told me about her pierogies, remember? How she makes them every Sunday after church." Danny's eyes fluttered open, glassy with morphine and shock. "Nurse Mercer," he managed, his voice barely audible over the distant rumble of German Panzer tanks. "Am I going to make it home?" To date, Grace had learned in her 6 months in Europe that there were 3 types of lies a combat nurse told. The ones that saved lives, the ones that gave comfort, and the ones that haunted you forever. She chose the second type now, forcing warmth into her voice that her frozen face could barely express. "You're going home, soldier. I promise you that." If you're watching this story unfold and want to hear more tales of courage from the darkest days of history, please subscribe to our channel and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Your support helps us share these important stories. The truth was far less certain. Grace had been stationed at this forward aid post for 11 days. 11 days since the German offensive had smashed through the supposedly quiet Ardennes sector, catching the American forces completely off guard. What was supposed to be a rest area for tired divisions had become a frozen hell of desperate fighting, and Grace's small medical team had been cut off from the main American lines for the past week. They had 27 wounded men, rapidly dwindling medical supplies, and no clear path to evacuation. The radio had gone silent 2 days ago, and the last supply drop had missed them by 3 miles, landing somewhere in German-controlled territory. Captain Mitchell Hayes, the ranking medical officer, entered through the makeshift tarp that served as a door, his face grey with exhaustion and something else, fear, though he tried to hide it. At 34, Hayes was old for a combat surgeon, having been pulled from a comfortable practice in Boston to serve his country. He'd been competent enough in the field hospitals behind the lines, but here, in this frozen nightmare with artillery fire growing closer by the hour, Grace had watched him begin to unravel. "How's Kowalski?" Hayes asked, not meeting her eyes. "Stable, for now, but he needs a proper hospital, not whatever this is." Grace finished the last stitch and began wrapping Danny's shoulder with their diminishing supply of bandages. "We're down to maybe 40 morphine syrettes, Captain. Half of these men are going to need another dose before morning." Hayes ran a hand through his thinning hair, dislodging the snow that had accumulated there. "I need to talk to you outside." The cold hit Grace like a physical blow as she followed Hayes out into the courtyard, where Corporal James Washington stood guard, his rifle pointed at the tree line. Washington was from Alabama, a quiet man who had barely spoken during the first months of their deployment, but had become fiercely protective of the medical staff since the German offensive began. He nodded at Grace as she passed, his dark eyes constantly scanning the shadows between the snow-laden pines. "What is it, Captain?" Grace asked, though the tightness in her chest suggested she already knew. Hayes pulled out a crumpled map, spreading it against the stone wall. "I've been studying our position. The Germans are advancing on 3 sides. Major Patterson and the rest of the battalion are somewhere to the north, but we've had no contact. To the south and east, it's all German armor and infantry." His finger traced a route to the west. "This is the only possible corridor. If we move tonight through the forest, we might be able to reach the American lines before the pocket closes completely." "Move!" Grace stared at him. "Captain, half these men can't walk. Danny Kowalski just came out of shock. Private Rodriguez has a shattered femur. Sergeant Miller—" "I know the casualty list, Lieutenant," Hayes interrupted, his voice sharp. Then, softer. "Grace, if we stay here, we're all dead. The Germans will overrun this position within 48 hours, maybe less. At least if we move, some of us have a chance." "Some of us," Grace repeated, the words bitter on her tongue. "You mean the ones who can walk?" Hayes finally met her eyes, and she saw the decision already made there. "We take the walking wounded and the medical staff. We move fast, travel light. It's the only logical choice." "It's murder," Grace said flatly. "You're talking about abandoning critically wounded American soldiers to die in the snow or be captured by the Germans." "I'm talking about saving the lives we can save." Hayes's voice rose, then dropped to an urgent whisper as Washington glanced their way. "Grace, please, I have a wife, 2 daughters. They're 6 and 8 years old. I promised Margaret I'd come home." Grace thought of her own family back in Nebraska, her father, who'd driven her to the train station with tears streaming down his weathered face, her mother, who'd pressed a small Bible into her hands and made her promise to read it every night, her younger brother Tommy, who'd enlisted in the Navy and was somewhere in the Pacific. She thought of all the promises people made before war taught them that some promises couldn't be kept. "I'm not leaving them, Captain," she said quietly. "These men trusted us to take care of them. That's what I'm going to do." Hayes stared at her for a long moment, something crumbling behind his eyes. "Then you're a fool, and you're going to die here." "Maybe," Grace acknowledged, "but I'll die doing my job." The captain folded his map with shaking hands. "I'm ordering the evacuation for 0300 hours. Anyone who can walk goes with us. That includes you, Lieutenant. That's a direct order." With all due respect, sir, you can take that order and—" A sharp whistle from Washington cut through their argument. The corporal was pointing toward the tree line, where dark shapes were moving between the pines. Grace's heart hammered as she counted at least a dozen figures, and then more emerging from the forest. For a terrible moment she thought it was the German advance, but then she recognized the silhouettes of American helmets, the way they moved in tactical formation. "Friendlies!" Washington called out, relief flooding his voice. "American patrol coming in!" The lead figure resolved into a tall man with lieutenant's bars, his face so caked with dirt and frost that his age was impossible to determine. Behind him came a ragged column of soldiers, maybe 40 men total, many of them limping, all of them carrying that hollow-eyed look that came from too many days of combat without sleep. "This the aid station?" the lieutenant asked, his voice hoarse. "What's left of it," Hayes answered. "Lieutenant Brian Foster, 506th Regiment, and we're damn glad to see you boys. We thought we were completely cut off." The new arrival didn't smile. "You are cut off. My platoon got separated from the main battalion 3 days ago. We've been trying to find a way back to the American lines, but the Germans have this whole sector locked down tight." He surveyed the damaged farmhouse with a professional eye. "How many wounded you got?" 27 who can't be moved easily," Grace said. "Another 15 walking wounded who could manage with support." Foster nodded slowly, then turned to his men. "Sergeant Matthews, set up a perimeter. Put our wounded inside and get them looked at. Everyone else, defensive positions around the farmhouse. Germans are maybe 2 hours behind us, so we don't have much time." As Foster's soldiers began spreading out, Grace noticed something in their eyes, not hope, but the grim determination of men who'd accepted they probably weren't getting out of this alive. These were paratroopers, the elite of the American airborne forces, and they moved with deadly efficiency even in their exhausted state. But they were also down to barely more than a platoon's strength, low on ammunition, and being hunted through frozen forest by an entire German division. Foster followed Grace and Hayes back into the aid station, where his medic, a thin corporal named Eddie Chen from San Francisco, was already assessing the wounded with quick, professional movements. Chen had been a medical student before the war, and Grace could see the frustration in his eyes as he catalogued injuries that required surgery they couldn't provide, medications they didn't have, and time they'd run out of. "Lieutenant Mercer's been keeping these men alive for almost 2 weeks," Hayes said, and Grace heard something in his voice. Guilt, maybe, or shame for what he'd been about to do. "She's a miracle worker." "No miracles here, Captain," Grace said quietly, kneeling beside Private Rodriguez, whose fever had spiked again despite the cold. "Just bandages and prayer, and we're running low on both." Foster crouched down beside her, his movements stiff with cold and fatigue. Up close, Grace could see he was younger than she'd thought, maybe 26 or 27, with blue eyes that had seen too much. A thin scar ran from his left temple down to his jaw, still pink with recent healing. "My scouts report German armor forming up about 3 kilometers east," he said, keeping his voice low so the wounded men wouldn't hear. "They're preparing for a major push, probably planning to clear this whole area by tomorrow morning. We can't hold this position." "We can't evacuate the critical cases either," Grace replied, checking Rodriguez's pulse. "Not through winter forest with German patrols everywhere. Most of these men would die before we got half a mile." Foster was quiet for a moment, then, "During my jump into Normandy, my chute got tangled. I came down hard, broke my ankle in 3 places. There was a ranger medic, couldn't have been more than 20 years old, who found me in a ditch while German machine guns were tearing up everything around us. He didn't leave me, dragged me into a crater, set my ankle with sticks and his belt, then carried me on his back for 2 miles to an aid station, got shot twice doing it, once in the shoulder, once in the leg, kept going anyway." Foster met her eyes. "I asked him later why he risked his life for one injured soldier." "You know what he said?" Grace shook her head. "He said, 'That's the job, sir. We don't leave our people behind.'" Foster stood up, his decision made. "So, we're not leaving anybody. We hold this position until we can figure out a way to get everyone out, or we go down fighting. Those are the only 2 options I'm willing to consider." Something loosened in Grace's chest, the first breath of hope she'd felt in days. "Thank you, Lieutenant." "Thank me when we're all drinking coffee in a warm hospital somewhere," Foster said with a slight smile. Then louder to his men and the medical staff. "Listen up! We're turning this farmhouse into a fortress. I want fighting positions on all sides, fields of fire cleared, and every weapon we can spare pointed at those trees. The Germans want this position. They're going to have to pay for every inch of it with blood." As Foster's paratroopers began reinforcing the defenses, Grace returned to her patients, moving from one to the next with the automatic efficiency born of months of practice. She cleaned wounds, changed dressings, dispensed the last of their antibiotics, and spoke quiet words of encouragement to men who were trying very hard not to be afraid. Some of them were barely older than Tommy, her brother, who'd lied about his age to enlist at 16. Others were in their 30s, men with families and futures they desperately wanted to return to. Private First Class Marcus Webb, a farm boy from Iowa with a chest wound that had narrowly missed his heart, grabbed her hand as she passed. "Nurse Mercer, I heard the lieutenant talking. Are we going to make it?" Grace looked at his young face, still rounded with baby fat beneath the dirt and stubble, and thought about all the lies she'd told to comfort dying men. But Webb wasn't dying, not if she had anything to say about it. "You're going to make it, Marcus. We're all going to make it. You just need to keep fighting, same as the rest of us." Webb nodded, some of the fear leaving his eyes. "My dad always said you folks in the medical corps were the real heroes. Said the guys with guns get all the medals, but the ones who patch us up are the ones who really save lives." "Your dad sounds like a smart man," Grace said, squeezing his hand before moving on. Night fell early in the Ardennes winter, darkness coming like a heavy blanket by 1700 hours. Foster posted guards in 4-hour shifts and rationed out what little food remained, mostly hardtack and canned beef that tasted like salted cardboard. Grace forced herself to eat, knowing she'd need the strength for what was coming. Around her, the wounded men tried to sleep, their soft groans and occasional cries of pain, a constant reminder of how precarious their situation had become. Corporal Chen sat down beside Grace, his back against the stone wall. "You ever think about what you'd be doing if there wasn't a war?" he asked quietly. Grace considered the question. "I had a job lined up at a hospital in Omaha. Good pay, regular hours, clean sheets on every bed. Seems like another lifetime now." "I was going to be a surgeon," Chen said. "Had 2 more years of medical school left. My professor said I had talented hands." He held up those hands now, steady despite the cold and exhaustion. "Guess I'm getting a different kind of education out here." "The best surgeons I've ever known learned their trade in combat," Grace told him. "When this war's over, you're going to save a lot of lives, Eddie." "If we survive," Chen said simply. "When we survive," Grace corrected. "I don't believe in if anymore, just when and how." Around midnight, the temperature dropped even further, and frost began forming on the inside walls of the farmhouse. Grace made her rounds again, checking that every wounded man had at least 1 blanket, redistributing what body heat they could share. She found Private Kowalski awake, staring at the ceiling with wide eyes. "Can't sleep?" she asked, sitting beside him. "Every time I close my eyes, I'm back in that foxhole," Danny whispered. "The Germans came out of nowhere, Nurse Mercer. We were just sitting there playing cards, trying to stay warm. Then the world exploded and Jimmy—" His voice broke. "Jimmy was sitting right next to me. We grew up together in Pittsburgh, went through basic training together, shipped out together. Then he was there and then he wasn't, and there was just blood and snow and—" "Hey," Grace said firmly, gripping his good shoulder, "you're here now. You're safe. I'm not going to let anything happen to you." "How can you promise that?" Danny asked, and there was something heartbreaking in his young voice. "How can anyone promise anything in this place?" Grace didn't have a good answer for that, so she did what her mother had done when she was frightened as a child. She began to sing. Softly, so as not to wake the others, she sang "Amazing Grace." Her voice steadied despite the cold and fear. Other voices joined in, Corporal Washington's deep bass, Chen's uncertain tenor, even Captain Hayes from across the room. The song filled the farmhouse, a small light against the darkness outside. When the hymn ended, Danny was asleep, his breathing regular. Grace stayed beside him for a while longer, then rose to continue her rounds. As she moved through the wounded, checking pulses and adjusting blankets, she became aware of Lieutenant Foster watching her from the doorway. "That was beautiful," he said quietly. "My mother taught me that song when I was 6 years old," Grace replied. "She said music was a kind of medicine too," Foster nodded. "My father was a minister in Philadelphia. He used to say that faith was what separated humans from animals, the ability to hope even when hope seemed impossible." "Do you still believe that?" "I don't know," Foster admitted. "I've seen things in this war that make me question everything I thought I knew about God and humanity." But then I see people like you refusing to abandon the wounded, even when the smart thing would be to run. And I think maybe my father was right." Before Grace could respond, Sergeant Matthews appeared in the doorway, his face grim. "Sir, you need to see this." They followed Matthews outside into the brutal cold, where two of Foster's scouts had just returned from a reconnaissance patrol. Both men looked shaken, their faces pale in the moonlight that filtered through the clouds. "Report," Foster ordered. The lead scout, a lanky private named Jackson, pointed east. "Germans amassing for an attack, sir. We counted at least 2 companies of infantry, maybe 3, plus armor. I saw at least 4 Panthers and 6 half-tracks. They've got us surrounded on 3 sides, and they're not trying to hide anymore." "How long until they move?" Foster asked. "Dawn, probably. Maybe sooner if they decide to risk a night attack." Foster exchanged glances with Matthews, and Grace saw the calculation happening behind their eyes. 40-some tired soldiers and a handful of medical staff against several hundred German troops with tank support. The mathematics were brutally simple. "We need to consider our options," Captain Hayes said, stepping out into the cold. His voice had taken on that tight, desperate quality again. "Lieutenant Foster, with your men and our walking wounded, we could attempt a breakout to the west. We leave now. We might make it through before the Germans close the ring entirely." "And the men who can't walk?" Grace demanded. "What happens to them?" Hayes didn't answer, but his silence was answer enough. "No one's abandoning anyone," Foster said firmly. "We hold this position. We've got some advantages. The farmhouse gives us cover. We know the Germans will have to cross open ground to reach us, and American forces are still operating in this sector. If we can hold out long enough, relief might reach us." "And if it doesn't?" Hayes asked. Foster's jaw tightened. "Then we make them pay for every foot of ground. We make this farmhouse so costly to take that they'll remember it for the rest of the war. And we do it knowing that every minute we hold delays the German advance, gives other American units time to regroup and counterattack. That's worth something, Captain. That's worth everything." Grace felt tears prick her eyes, but she blinked them away. This was no time for emotion. "What do you need from us, Lieutenant?" "Keep doing what you've been doing," Foster said. "Keep these men alive. Keep their spirits up. When the fighting starts, stay low and stay out of the line of fire. Beyond that—" He paused, searching for words. "Beyond that, pray. If your mother's song is any indication, you're probably better at that than I am." The scouts reported back to their positions, and Foster began organizing his defense, placing his most experienced soldiers at the critical points, setting up overlapping fields of fire, preparing fallback positions within the farmhouse itself. Grace watched him work, impressed by his calm efficiency, even in the face of overwhelming odds. This was a man who'd accepted the possibility of death, but refused to surrender to it. Back inside, Grace found Chen preparing their remaining medical supplies, laying out instruments and bandages with meticulous care. "We're going to have casualties," he said matter-of-factly. "Lots of them, probably. I've got morphine for maybe 12 serious wounds, and bandages for perhaps 20. After that, we improvise," Grace finished. "We've been doing it for days already. We'll figure it out." But as she helped Chen prepare their aid station, transforming one corner of the farmhouse into an emergency surgical area, Grace felt the weight of what was coming, pressing down on her like the winter cold. She thought of all the wounded men scattered across the floor, boys like Danny Kowalski, who just wanted to go home to their mothers, men like Marcus Webb, who dreamed of Iowa farmland and clean country air. She thought of Foster's paratroopers, elite soldiers who'd survived so much already only to make their stand in this forgotten corner of Belgium. She thought of her own family, who wouldn't know if she lived or died until some officer appeared at their door with regrets and a folded flag. And then she thought of something her father had told her the day she'd announced her decision to join the Army Nurse Corps. He'd been working in his workshop, building a cradle for a neighbor's expected baby, his weathered hands moving with the precision born of 40 years of carpentry. "Grace," he'd said, not looking up from his work, "I'm scared for you. I'm terrified of what might happen over there, but I'm also proud. You're doing what needs to be done, and that takes courage I'm not sure I have." "You have plenty of courage, Dad," she'd replied. He'd finally looked up then, and she'd seen tears in his eyes. "Courage isn't not being afraid, honey. Courage is being terrified and doing the right thing anyway. You remember that, whatever happens over there. You do the right thing, even when it's hard, even when it's scary, and you come home to us." Grace had promised she would, just like so many other people had made promises before shipping out. Now, standing in a freezing Belgian farmhouse with German tanks closing in, she wondered if that was one more promise the war wouldn't let her keep. The night dragged on with agonizing slowness. Grace moved among the wounded, dispensing what comfort she could, while Foster's men took turns sleeping in 2-hour shifts, always keeping half the force awake and alert. Around 0400 hours, Private Rodriguez's fever spiked dangerously high, and Grace spent an hour bathing him with freezing water from the courtyard well, desperately trying to bring his temperature down. Chen helped her, the two of them working in silent coordination, united by the singular purpose of keeping one more soldier alive for one more day. "I had a brother," Chen said quietly as they worked. "Daniel. He was 2 years older than me, and he enlisted in the Marines right after Pearl Harbor, died on Guadalcanal in 1942. My parents—" His voice caught. "My parents didn't speak for 3 months after the telegram came. They just moved through the house like ghosts, and I didn't know how to help them." "I'm sorry, Eddie," Grace said, meaning it. "The thing is," Chen continued, "Daniel always said he was going to be a teacher. He wanted to teach history to high school kids, help them understand the world. And I think about all the students he'll never teach, all the lives he'll never touch, and I wonder what the point of any of this is." Grace adjusted the cold compress on Rodriguez's forehead, considering her answer carefully. "The point is that we're here right now, trying to save this boy's life. Maybe that doesn't make sense in some grand philosophical way, but it's all we've got. We can't change what happened to your brother or to the thousands of other men who've died in this war, but we can fight like hell to save the ones we can reach. That has to mean something." Chen nodded slowly. Yeah, I think you're right." Rodriguez's fever finally broke just before dawn, and Grace allowed herself a moment of relief. One more life pulled back from the edge, one more small victory against the darkness. She was washing her hands in a bucket of frigid water when Sergeant Matthews burst into the farmhouse. "They're coming," he said simply. Grace dried her hands and moved to the window, carefully peering through the small gap between the boards they'd nailed over the shattered glass. In the grey pre-dawn light, she could see them, German infantry advancing through the snow in organized waves, their field-grey uniforms almost invisible against the winter landscape. Behind them, the massive shapes of Panther tanks rolled forward, their long 75mm guns pointed at the farmhouse. Foster appeared beside her, binoculars to his eyes. About 200 infantry, supported by armor. "They're going to hit us from the east and south simultaneously. Try to overwhelm us with firepower." "Can we hold?" Grace asked. "For a while," Foster said. "Maybe long enough." He didn't say for what, and Grace didn't ask. The lieutenant moved through his defensive positions, offering quiet words of encouragement to his men, checking firing angles, ensuring everyone understood the plan. Grace watched him work and understood why his soldiers would follow him into impossible situations. There was something in Foster that refused to accept defeat, some core of steel that the war hadn't managed to break. The German advance paused about 400 yards out, just beyond effective rifle range. For a long moment, everything was silent except for the wind moaning through the broken windows. Then, with a sound like tearing canvas, the German artillery opened up. The world exploded into noise and violence. Shells screamed overhead, impacting around the farmhouse, sending up geysers of frozen earth and snow. The building shook with each near miss, dust and mortar raining down from the ceiling. Grace threw herself over Private Kowalski, shielding him with her body as a shell struck the roof, tearing away a section of tiles and letting in the bitter morning air. "Everyone down!" Foster shouted over the din. "Stay away from the windows!" "They're trying to soften us up before the infantry assault." The barrage lasted for 10 minutes, that felt like hours. When it finally stopped, Grace's ears were ringing and her hands were shaking, but she forced herself to move, checking on her patients. Miraculously, none of the wounded had been hit by the shrapnel that had torn through the walls, though several were in shock from the violence of the attack. "They're coming!" someone shouted from the eastern window. Grace looked up to see German infantry emerging from the tree line, moving in short rushes across the open ground. They were professionals, she could tell. Wehrmacht regulars, not the green conscripts or old men that sometimes made up German units this late in the war. They used cover expertly, supporting each other's advances with disciplined fire. Foster's paratroopers opened up, their M1 Garands cracking in steady rhythm. Germans fell, but more kept coming, and behind them the tanks were advancing, their machine guns chattering, their main guns firing high explosive rounds that punched through the farmhouse walls like paper. Grace pulled Danny Kowalski away from the eastern wall just as a tank round tore through exactly where he'd been lying, the shell continuing through and exploding in the courtyard outside. The concussion knocked her off her feet, and for a moment she couldn't hear anything but a high-pitched ringing. Chen grabbed her arm, pulling her up, shouting something she couldn't make out. Then her hearing began to return, and with it, the sounds of battle. Gunfire, explosions, men screaming orders and warnings. "We need to move the critical cases to the cellar," Chen shouted directly into her ear. "It's the only place that might survive if they bring the whole building down." Grace nodded, and together they began the desperate work of moving wounded men who shouldn't be moved. Matthews and 2 other soldiers helped, carrying the stretcher cases down the narrow stone steps into the cellar, while bullets cracked overhead and shells continued to pound the farmhouse. Danny Kowalski refused to go. "I can still fight," he insisted, clutching a rifle someone had given him. "I'm not hiding in a cellar while everyone else is up here dying." "Danny, your shoulder?" "My other arm works fine," Danny said, and there was something in his eyes that told Grace he'd made his decision. Some men broke under the pressure of combat, but others found something harder inside themselves, something that wouldn't bend. Danny had found that thing, and Grace recognized it because she'd found it in herself weeks ago, maybe months ago, back when this had just been an adventure instead of a daily struggle for survival. "Stay low," she told him. "And if I call for you, you come running. Understood?" "Yes, ma'am," Danny said, and despite everything, he smiled. The German attack intensified. They'd reached the outbuildings now, firing from covered positions, their numbers allowing them to maintain constant pressure on every side of the farmhouse. Foster's men fought back with desperate efficiency, but Grace could see they were being worn down, ammunition running low, casualties mounting. A paratrooper named Collins took a bullet through the throat, and Grace found herself in the middle of the chaos, pressing gauze against the wound while bullets cracked overhead. Blood poured over her hands, hot and red, and Collins's eyes were wide with terror and the knowledge of his own death. "Stay with me," Grace commanded, her voice somehow steady despite the pandemonium. "Eddie, I need you here now." Chen appeared, his medical kit already open. Together they worked with frantic precision, packing the wound, trying to stop the bleeding. But the bullet had severed the carotid artery, and there was nothing they could do except hold Collins's hand and tell him lies about how he was going to be fine, going to see his girl in Chicago again. going to walk through Lincoln Park on a spring day when all this madness was behind them. Collins died 30 seconds later, his last breath a soft sigh that seemed almost grateful. Grace closed his eyes and moved on to the next wounded man, because that was all she could do. Keep moving, keep fighting, keep trying to hold back death for one more minute, one more hour, one more day. The German attack broke against the farmhouse defenses like waves against a rock. 3 times they surged forward, and 3 times Foster's paratroopers drove them back with concentrated fire. But the cost was mounting. 12 of Foster's men down, maybe half of them dead, the rest adding to the crowded cellar where the most critically wounded sheltered. During a brief lull, Foster found Grace in what had become her surgical area, working on a young soldier who'd taken shrapnel in the abdomen. Blood covered her uniform, her hands, her face. She'd stopped noticing hours ago. "How many can you save?" Foster asked quietly. Grace didn't pause in her work. "All of them, if you give me time." "I might not be able to give you much more time," Foster admitted. "They're regrouping for another push, and this time they're bringing more armor. We're down to maybe 60 rounds per man, and half my soldiers are wounded. When they come again, you'll hold them," Grace interrupted. "Because that's what we do, Lieutenant. We hold the line. We don't quit. We don't surrender. We don't leave our people behind." Foster smiled despite everything. "You sound like a soldier, Nurse Mercer." "I am a soldier," Grace said. "I just fight with different weapons." A massive explosion rocked the farmhouse, and the ceiling partially collapsed, burying 2 men under rubble. Grace and Foster rushed to dig them out, their hands bleeding as they tore at the stone and timber. They pulled out Corporal Washington first, unconscious but alive, then Matthews, who had a broken arm but was still trying to get back to his position. "Sir," Matthews said through gritted teeth as Chen splintered his arm, "they're flanking us, Germans coming through the western tree line." Foster's jaw tightened. "How many?" "At least 50, maybe more. They must have worked their way around during the last attack." "That's it then," Captain Hayes said from the cellar entrance. His face was grey, his hands shaking. "We're surrounded, outgunned, and running out of ammunition. Lieutenant, you need to order a surrender before they kill us all." "I don't accept surrenders," Foster said flatly, "and I don't give them either." "That's insane!" Hayes's voice rose to a shout. "You're going to get everyone killed for pride, for honor, for nothing." "For everything," Foster corrected. He turned to his remaining soldiers. "Listen up. We've got Germans coming from the west now, so we're going to have to thin our lines on the other sides to cover it. Every round counts from here on out. Make your shots matter. Make them remember this day." Grace watched Hayes's face crumble, saw the moment when the last of his courage finally broke. The captain stumbled back down into the cellar, and she knew he wouldn't be coming back up. Some men had limits to what they could endure, and Hayes had found his. She couldn't blame him, not really, but she also couldn't follow him. The western attack came fast and brutal. German infantry rushed the farmhouse while their comrades on the other sides kept up suppressing fire, a coordinated assault that finally overwhelmed Foster's thin defensive line. Germans breached the western wall, pouring into the farmhouse, and suddenly the battle was happening at close quarters, men grappling with each other, rifles and bayonets flashing in the dim light. Grace found herself back-to-back with Danny Kowalski, both of them firing pistols at the grey-clad figures that seemed to fill every corner. She'd never fired a weapon in anger before today, had never imagined herself capable of it. But survival had a way of revealing capabilities you didn't know you possessed. A German soldier came at her with a bayonet, and she pulled the trigger, watched him fall, then immediately turned to the next threat. It was chaos, primitive and terrifying, the kind of fighting that belonged to an earlier age of warfare. Men fought with rifle butts and knives, with fists and desperation. Somewhere in the madness, Grace heard Foster's voice, still giving orders, still trying to maintain some semblance of tactical coherence even as everything fell apart. Then, impossibly, the Germans were retreating, falling back through the breach they'd made, leaving their dead and wounded behind. Grace stood in the wreckage of what had been the Western Wall, her pistol empty, her uniform soaked with blood, some of it hers, most of it belonging to people she couldn't even identify anymore. "Why?" she gasped to Foster, who appeared beside her, his face a mask of blood and soot. Why did they pull back? Foster pointed east, and Grace saw it, fresh smoke rising from the German positions, the sound of heavy weapons fire, American voices shouting commands. "Reinforcements," Foster said, and his voice cracked with emotion. "Someone broke through to us." The next hour passed in a blur of frantic activity as American tanks and infantry smashed into the German forces surrounding the farmhouse, breaking the siege. Grace barely registered the fighting, focused entirely on the wounded. So many wounded, German and American alike, all of them bleeding, all of them in need of help that she couldn't provide fast enough. A tank rolled up to the farmhouse, and a major climbed out, his face shocked as he surveyed the carnage. "Jesus Christ," he muttered. "How long have you people been holding this position?" "Too long," Foster replied, "but not long enough." Medics poured in, bringing supplies, proper equipment, the resources that had been absent for so many days. Grace found herself pushed aside, no longer needed now that trained surgical teams had arrived. She stood in the courtyard, swaying with exhaustion, watching as stretcher-bearers carried out the wounded, both those she'd managed to keep alive and those she hadn't. Chen found her there, his uniform as blood-soaked as hers. "Rodriguez is going to make it," he said. "They've got him on a truck to the field hospital. Kowalski too, Matthews, Webb. Most of them, Grace. We saved most of them." Grace nodded, too tired for words. She kept her promise to Danny Kowalski. He was going home to Pittsburgh, to his mother's pierogies and Sunday church services. She kept her promise to Private Webb, to Rodriguez, to all the others. Some promises could be kept, even in war. Foster approached, limping from a wound he'd apparently sustained without mentioning it. "The major's putting me in for a Silver Star. I told him the medal should go to you." "I don't need a medal," Grace said. "I just need a hot shower and about 12 hours of sleep." "How about 48 hours of sleep in a real hospital bed?" Foster offered. "They're evacuating all medical personnel back to Paris for recovery. You've more than earned it." Grace looked at the farmhouse, at the bodies still being carried out, at the snow stained red with blood. She thought about Captain Hayes, who'd wanted to run, who'd broken under the pressure. She thought about the promises she'd made and the ones she'd kept. She thought about her father's words, "Courage is being terrified and doing the right thing anyway." 48 hours, she agreed. "Then I'm coming back. There are more wounded soldiers out here who need help." Foster smiled. "I wouldn't expect anything less, Lieutenant Mercer." As they loaded her onto a truck with the other wounded, Grace looked back one last time at the shattered farmhouse. It didn't look like much, just another damaged building in a war full of damaged buildings. But she knew that years from now, when veterans told their stories, they'd talk about this place. They'd talk about the nurse who wouldn't abandon her patients, about the paratroopers who held impossible odds, about the cold December day when a small group of Americans decided that some things were worth dying for. The truck rolled away through the snow, carrying Grace toward safety, toward warmth and rest, and the brief illusion of peace. But she knew she'd be back. There were more battles to fight, more wounded to save, more promises to keep. The war wasn't over, wouldn't be over for months yet. But for today, for this moment, she'd done enough. She'd kept her soldiers alive. She'd held the line. She'd proven that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was simply refuse to quit, even when quitting was the only sensible option. As the farmhouse disappeared behind them, Grace closed her eyes and finally let herself sleep, knowing that when she woke, there would be more work to do, more lives to save, more impossible promises to somehow keep. But for now, for just a little while, she'd earned her rest. The American Field Hospital in Paris occupied what had once been a luxury hotel, its grand ballroom converted into a surgical ward, its ornate dining rooms now filled with rows of white beds. Grace woke in one of those beds 3 days after leaving the farmhouse, her body finally catching up with the exhaustion she'd been running on for weeks. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. The clean sheets, the warm air, the absence of gunfire, all seemed like impossible luxuries. A nurse appeared beside her bed, a captain with greying hair and kind eyes. "Welcome back, Lieutenant. You've been sleeping for 62 hours straight. How do you feel?" Grace tried to sit up and discovered her entire body was one massive ache, like I got run over by a tank. The captain smiled. "Not far from the truth, from what I hear. You're something of a legend around here, Lieutenant Mercer. Word is you held an aid station under siege for 2 weeks, kept 27 critical patients alive with almost no supplies, then fought off a German assault with a pistol." "I did my job," Grace said simply. "Your job." The captain shook her head. "Honey, what you did went way beyond your job. Colonel Peterson wants to see you when you're feeling up to it. He's talking about recommending you for the Distinguished Service Cross." Grace didn't want medals or recognition. She wanted to know about her patients. "The men from the farmhouse, Rodriguez, Kowalski, Webb, all of them, are they all right?" "Most of them are here in this hospital, actually. Rodriguez had surgery to repair his femur. He's going to walk with a limp, but he'll walk. Kowalski's shoulder is healing well. Webb's chest wound was touch and go for a while, but he pulled through. You saved their lives, Lieutenant. All of them." Something loosened in Grace's chest, a tension she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. "Can I see them? The doctors want you to rest for at least another day, but—" The captain paused, seeing something in Grace's face. "But I suppose a short visit wouldn't hurt. Let me get you a robe." Grace's legs were shaky as she walked through the converted hotel, but she forced them to carry her. She found Rodriguez first, his leg elevated in traction, reading a letter from home. His face lit up when he saw her. "Nurse Mercer, they said you were here, but I didn't believe them. I thought—" He stopped, emotions playing across his face. "I thought maybe you hadn't made it out." "Takes more than a few Germans to stop me," Grace said, sitting carefully in the chair beside his bed. "How's the leg?" "Doctors say I'll be dancing at my sister's wedding next year. She's getting married in July, wrote to tell me all about it. 6 months ago, I didn't think I'd live to see July." Rodriguez reached out and took Grace's hand. "You gave me that, Mom. You gave all of us that." Grace found Danny Kowalski in the recreation room, playing cards with 3 other soldiers from the farmhouse. He jumped up when he saw her, then winced as his shoulder reminded him it wasn't fully healed yet. "Nurse Mercer! Guys, this is her! This is the one I told you about!" The other soldiers stood, awkward and reverent, treating Grace like she was something special, instead of just someone who'd done what needed doing. She deflected their praise, asked about their wounds, their recovery, their plans for when they got home. Danny talked about Pittsburgh, about his mother's cooking, about the job waiting for him at his uncle's steel mill. He talked about the future like it was real, like it was something he could actually reach out and touch. "I'm naming my first daughter after you," Danny announced. "Grace Kowalski. Has a nice ring to it, don't you think?" "Your wife might have something to say about that," Grace replied, smiling despite herself. "Don't got a wife yet, but when I do, I'll make sure she understands. You're the reason I'm alive to have daughters in the first place." Grace spent 2 hours visiting with her patients, and each conversation filled her with a quiet pride she'd never felt before. These men were alive because she'd refused to leave them, because she'd chosen to stand and fight instead of run. In a war full of death and destruction, she'd managed to save something precious, not just lives, but futures, possibilities, all the things these young men would do and become in the years ahead. That evening, Colonel Peterson summoned her to his office. He was a career officer, late 50s, with the bearing of a man who'd seen too much war across too many decades. But his eyes were warm as he gestured for Grace to sit. "Lieutenant Mercer, I've been reading the reports from the Ardennes. From Lieutenant Foster, from the soldiers you treated, from Major Harrison, who led the relief force. They all say the same thing. You performed acts of extraordinary courage under the most difficult circumstances imaginable." "I was doing my job, sir," Grace said for what felt like the 100th time. "No," Peterson said firmly. "You were doing far more than your job." Captain Hayes submitted his own report, by the way. He recommended you for court-martial for refusing a direct order to evacuate. Grace's stomach dropped. "Sir, Peterson held up a hand. "I read his report, and then I read everyone else's reports, and then I had a long conversation with Captain Hayes himself. He's being reassigned to a training hospital in England. He won't be returning to combat duty." The colonel's expression softened slightly. "Not every man is cut out for the front lines, Lieutenant. There's no shame in that, though Hayes seems to think there is. But you—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "You're exactly the kind of soldier this army needs, not just because of your medical skills, but because of your character. You lead by example. You inspire those around you, and you refuse to compromise your principles even when it would be easier to do so." "Thank you, sir," Grace said quietly. "I'm putting you in for the Distinguished Service Cross, and I'm also recommending you for promotion to captain. God knows we need more officers like you." Peterson leaned back in his chair. "But before any of that happens, I need to know, are you willing to go back? After everything you've been through, no one would blame you if you requested reassignment to a rear-area hospital. You've more than earned it." Grace thought about the farmhouse, about the cold and the fear, and the desperate fight to keep men alive with nothing but determination and dwindling supplies. She thought about the moment when the Germans had breached the wall, when she'd been certain she was going to die. She thought about all of it, and then she thought about Rodriguez talking about his sister's wedding, about Danny Kowalski planning to name his future daughter after her, about all the lives that still needed saving. "I'm willing to go back, sir. That's where I'm needed." Peterson smiled. "I thought you'd say that. Take 2 weeks to recover, then report to the 45th Field Hospital. They're setting up near the German border in anticipation of the push into Germany itself." "It's going to be hard, Lieutenant, harder than anything we've faced so far. I understand, sir." "I hope you do," Peterson said quietly. "I really hope you do." Grace spent the next 2 weeks in a strange kind of limbo, caught between the violence she'd left behind and the violence waiting ahead. She walked the streets of Paris when she was strong enough, marveling at the city that had somehow survived 4 years of occupation. She wrote letters home, carefully editing out the worst parts, focusing instead on the small victories and the men she'd saved. Her mother wrote back with news from Nebraska. Tommy had been transferred to a new ship. The neighbor's son had come home missing an arm. The winter wheat crop was looking good, despite the labor shortages. She also received a letter from Lieutenant Foster, who'd been promoted to captain and was now commanding a company somewhere in Belgium. He wrote about the continuing push toward Germany, about the slow, grinding advance through winter weather and determined German resistance. He mentioned her in passing, calling her the bravest person he'd ever known, and Grace read that line 3 times before folding the letter and putting it away. On her last day in Paris, Grace visited the American Cathedral, a Gothic building that had served as a refuge for Allied airmen during the occupation. She sat in a pew near the back, not really praying, but not exactly not praying either, just trying to find some quiet space to think about what lay ahead. An army chaplain found her there, a major with a kind face and chaplain's crosses on his collar. "Mind if I join you, Lieutenant?" Grace shook her head, and the chaplain sat beside her, both of them silent for a long moment. "I've been counseling a lot of soldiers lately," the chaplain said eventually. "Men coming back from the front, trying to make sense of what they've seen, what they've done. They ask me questions I don't always have good answers for. Why does God allow war? Why do good men die while evil men survive? How do you reconcile faith with the things you've witnessed?" "What do you tell them?" Grace asked. "I tell them that I don't know, that I struggle with the same questions. That faith isn't about having all the answers. It's about choosing to hope even when hope seems foolish." The chaplain looked at her directly. "But I also tell them about people like you, Lieutenant. People who wade into hell itself because someone needs help. People who prove that even in the darkest circumstances, human beings are capable of extraordinary goodness. That helps, I think. It helps to know that the darkness hasn't won completely." Grace thought about that conversation for a long time after the chaplain left. She'd never thought of herself as particularly good or brave. She'd just done what seemed necessary in the moment. But maybe that was what bravery was in the end. Not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. The 45th Field Hospital was a sprawling collection of tents and hastily erected buildings near the German border, close enough that they could hear the rumble of artillery fire day and night. Grace reported for duty on a cold February morning, her new captain's bars still shiny and unfamiliar on her collar. The chief nurse, Major Sarah Winters, was a no-nonsense woman from Boston who'd been in the Army Nurse Corps since before Pearl Harbor. She looked Grace up and down with sharp eyes. "I've heard about you, Captain Mercer, the legend from the Ardennes. Some of the nurses here are going to expect you to walk on water." "I assure you I can't," Grace replied. Winters smiled slightly. "Good. Humility is useful in a combat hospital. Pride gets people killed." She gestured toward the surgical tents. "We're running 3 operating theaters around the clock, processing casualties from the push toward the Rhine. We've got good surgeons, adequate supplies, and enough morphine for now. What we don't have is enough time. The wounded keep coming faster than we can treat them." Grace had seen field hospitals before, but nothing on this scale. Ambulances rolled in constantly, disgorging loads of wounded men, some walking, some on stretchers, all of them bearing the marks of modern warfare. Burns from tank fires, shrapnel wounds from artillery, the distinctive injuries from machine gun fire and grenades. The surgeons worked with assembly line efficiency, triaging the wounded into 3 categories: those who would live without immediate intervention, those who might live with immediate surgery, and those who were beyond saving. It was that 3rd category that haunted Grace. The dying men were moved to a separate tent, given morphine to ease their pain, and attended by a chaplain and a dedicated nurse whose only job was to ensure no one died alone. Grace volunteered for that duty her first night, sitting with young soldiers as they slipped away, holding their hands, listening to their final words, writing down messages for families who would never see their sons again. Private First Class James Murphy from Chicago whispered about a girl named Susan who worked at a diner on Michigan Avenue. Sergeant Robert Chen, no relation to the Eddie Chen she'd known at the farmhouse, talked about his parents' grocery store in Seattle and how much he'd wanted to take it over someday. Corporal Michael O'Brien recited Hail Marys with his last breaths, his Catholic faith giving him comfort that Grace wished she could provide. By dawn, 12 men had died in that tent, and Grace had borne witness to every death. She emerged into the cold morning air, exhausted and hollowed out, only to find Major Winters waiting for her. "First night in the dying tent is always the hardest," Winters said, handing Grace a cup of coffee that tasted like burnt motor oil, but was hot and caffeinated. "You can request different duty if you need it. No one would think less of you." "I'll stay," Grace said. "Those men deserve someone who cares about them in their final moments. I can be that person." Winters studied her for a long moment. "You know, there are two types of nurses who volunteer for the dying tent. The first type burn out in a week, unable to bear the weight of all that death. The second type—" she paused. "The second type find a way to carry it without breaking. I think you might be the second type, Captain Mercer." "I don't feel unbreakable," Grace admitted. "No one does," Winters replied. "But we keep going anyway. That's all any of us can do." The weeks blurred together in a haze of blood and exhaustion. The American forces were pushing hard toward the Rhine River, the last major natural barrier before the German heartland, and the Wehrmacht was fighting with desperate ferocity to hold them back. The casualties reflected that desperation, hundreds of wounded men flowing through the hospital each day, overwhelming even their expanded facilities. Grace worked 18-hour shifts, moving between the surgical tents, the recovery wards, and the dying tent. She assisted in amputations, treated infections, held retractors while surgeons removed shrapnel from vital organs. She also spent hours simply talking to the wounded men, listening to their stories, reminding them that they were more than just broken bodies on an operating table. She met Corporal Thomas Baker, a farm boy from Iowa who'd lost both legs to a German mine but was determined to go home and help his father work their land. "I'll figure out how to drive a tractor sitting down," he said with grim determination. "My dad's getting old. He needs help, legs or no legs." She met Staff Sergeant William Foster, no relation to the Brian Foster from the farmhouse, who'd taken a bullet through the spine and would never walk again. He was 24 years old, engaged to be married, and trying to figure out how to tell his fiancée that the future they'd planned was gone. Grace sat with him for hours, not offering empty platitudes, but just listening as he worked through his grief and rage. She met countless others, each with their own story, their own wounds, both physical and otherwise, and she tried to help each one, to give them some small comfort in the midst of their suffering. One night in early March, Grace was working in the surgical tent when they brought in a soldier who'd been caught in a German flamethrower attack. His burns covered over 60% of his body, and Grace knew immediately that he wasn't going to survive. But he was conscious and in terrible pain, begging for help that she couldn't provide. The surgeon, Captain David Morrison, looked at the burned soldier and then at Grace. "Get him to the dying tent. There's nothing we can do here except waste morphine that other men need." Grace stared at Morrison, shocked. "He's still alive. We have to try." "He's dead. He just doesn't know it yet," Morrison said flatly. "I've got 3 other men on this table who might actually survive if I get to them in time. So take him to the dying tent and let him go peacefully." Grace wanted to argue, wanted to insist that every life was worth fighting for, but she'd been in enough triage situations to know Morrison was right from a pure medical standpoint. The burned soldier wouldn't survive another hour, and the morphine they'd used trying to save him could ease the pain of 3 or 4 men who had actual chances. She helped the medics carry the soldier to the dying tent, then stayed with him, administering morphine in doses heavy enough to ease his agony. His name was Private David Sullivan, and he was 19 years old, from a small town in Pennsylvania. His mother was a teacher. His father worked in a coal mine. He had 2 younger sisters who he'd promised to take to the Philadelphia Zoo when he got home. "Tell them I tried," David whispered through burned lips. "Tell my sisters I tried to come home." "I'll tell them," Grace promised, though she knew she'd never actually meet his family, would never have the chance to deliver that message personally. It was another lie told for comfort, another small mercy in a world that had precious few. David Sullivan died 20 minutes later, his ruined hand clutching Grace's. She sat with him for a while after he was gone, then wrote his name and his message in the small notebook she kept for such purposes. She had pages of names now, pages of final words, an archive of last moments that she didn't know what to do with but couldn't bring herself to throw away. When she finally emerged from the dying tent, she found Eddie Chen waiting for her. He'd been transferred to the 45th Field Hospital 2 weeks earlier, and Grace had been glad to have a familiar face around. "I heard about Sullivan," Eddie said quietly. "Morrison's an asshole, but he's not wrong. We don't have the resources to save everyone." "I know," Grace said. "I know that up here." She tapped her head. "But knowing it and accepting it are different things." Eddie nodded. "My brother Daniel, I told you about him, died on Guadalcanal. He wrote me a letter before he shipped out. Said that if he died, he wanted me to remember that his death meant something, that he died trying to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. I used to think that was just patriotic nonsense, but now—" He paused. "Now I think maybe he was right. Sullivan died because he answered his country's call. There's honor in that, even if it's not much comfort." Grace thought about all the men she'd watched die, all the promises she'd made to remember them, to honor their sacrifice. "Sometimes I wonder if we're doing enough, if anything we do here actually matters in the grand scheme of things." "It matters to the ones we save," Eddie said. "Rodriguez is in Iowa right now, working on his family's farm. Kowalski's back in Pittsburgh. Webb got married last month. His wife wrote to thank you. The letter's in the mail office. It matters to them, Grace. It matters to their families. That has to count for something." Before Grace could respond, the air raid sirens began to wail. German bombers coming for the hospital despite the red crosses painted on every roof. Everyone scrambled for the air raid shelters, everyone except Grace and Eddie, who ran toward the recovery wards, where the bedridden patients couldn't evacuate themselves. The first bombs fell as they reached the largest ward, explosions that shook the ground and sent shrapnel screaming through the air. Grace threw herself over a patient, protecting him with her body as the windows exploded inward. Eddie did the same, covering another soldier as the world turned into noise and violence. The raid lasted 7 minutes. When the all-clear sounded, Grace emerged to find the hospital partially destroyed, 3 tents burning, wounded men scattered across the muddy ground. She and Eddie immediately began triaging the new casualties, working alongside the other nurses and medics who'd survived. Major Winters appeared, blood streaming from a cut on her forehead, already organizing the chaos into something resembling order. "Get the critical cases into the undamaged surgical tents. Everyone else, start setting up field stations. Move, people. We've got wounded who need help now." Grace worked through the night and into the next day, operating on autopilot, her training and experience carrying her through when her conscious mind wanted to shut down. She stitched wounds, set broken bones, administered morphine and antibiotics and whatever else she could find in the partially destroyed supply tent. She saved some lives and lost others, and she tried not to think too hard about the randomness of it all. How a man might survive a German machine gun only to die from shrapnel during an air raid. How fate and chance played such enormous roles in who lived and who died. By the time reinforcements arrived from a rear area hospital, Grace had been awake for 36 hours straight. Major Winters found her in the ruins of a storage tent, sitting on an overturned crate, staring at nothing. "Captain Mercer, you need to rest." "There's still work to do," Grace said automatically. "There's always work to do," Winters replied, "but you're no good to anyone if you collapse from exhaustion. That's an order, Captain. 6 hours of sleep, minimum." Grace didn't remember walking to her tent or lying down on her cot. She just remembered closing her eyes and falling into darkness, too tired even to dream. She woke to find Eddie Chen sitting beside her cot, reading a medical journal by lamplight. "You've been asleep for 9 hours," he said. "Winter's let you sleep because we finally got enough reinforcements to handle the load." Grace sat up slowly, every muscle in her body aching. "What's the casualty count from the raid?" 14 dead, 32 wounded. Could have been worse. A lot of the wounded survived because you and I got to them quickly. Eddie set down his journal. "Grace, I need to tell you something. I've been recommended for transfer to a surgical unit heading into Germany. They want me because of my medical school training, think I can assist the forward surgeons better than most medics." "That's wonderful, Eddie," Grace said, meaning it even as she felt a pang of loss. Eddie had become a friend, someone who understood the weight they both carried. "The thing is," Eddie continued, "they need more nurses too. Experienced combat nurses who can handle the pressure of working right behind the front lines. I recommended you." Grace looked at him sharply. "You did what?" "I recommended you for transfer to the forward surgical teams. Grace, you're wasted here. You're too good, too skilled, too brave to be working in a field hospital when you could be saving lives at the point of maximum danger." Eddie leaned forward. "I know it sounds crazy, going even closer to the fighting, but that's where we're needed most. That's where we can make the biggest difference." Grace thought about it for a long moment. The field hospital was hard enough, exhausting enough, dangerous enough. Moving even closer to the front lines would mean more risk, more stress, more death. But it would also mean being where she was most needed, being able to help soldiers in their most critical moments. "When do they need an answer?" she asked. "By tomorrow morning. We'd be leaving in 3 days, heading east with the Third Army as they push into Germany." Eddie smiled slightly. "I know it's a lot to think about. You don't have to say yes just because I did." But Grace already knew her answer. She'd known it the moment Eddie had mentioned the transfer. Some people were built to play it safe, to work in the rear areas where it was relatively comfortable and secure. But Grace had learned something about herself during that long siege at the farmhouse. She was built for the hard things, the impossible things, the moments when everything hung in the balance and someone had to step forward and refuse to quit. "Tell them yes," Grace said. "I'll go." Eddie's smile widened. "I thought you might say that." The next 3 days passed in a blur of preparations and goodbyes. Grace said farewell to the patients she'd been treating, to the nurses she'd worked alongside, to Major Winters, who gripped her hand firmly and said, "You're going to do great things, Captain Mercer. Just make sure you survive to tell about them." On a cold March morning, Grace climbed into the back of a truck along with Eddie Chen and 6 other medical personnel who'd volunteered for forward duty. They drove east through liberated French and Belgian territory, past burned-out German vehicles and hastily dug graves, past towns that had been reduced to rubble by the fighting. The closer they got to Germany, the worse the destruction became. Whole villages obliterated, fields cratered by artillery fire, forests stripped bare by combat. They reached the forward surgical unit just as American forces were preparing to cross the Rhine River, the last major obstacle before the German heartland. The unit consisted of 4 surgical tents set up in a partially destroyed German town, maybe a mile behind the front lines. The chief surgeon, Colonel James Harrison, was a gruff man from Texas who believed in efficiency above all else. "Welcome to the sharp end," Harrison said, eyeing the new arrivals. "You're going to see things here that you won't see anywhere else. We get casualties straight from the battlefield, often within minutes of being wounded. Our job is to stabilize them enough for transport to the field hospitals. Speed is everything. The faster we work, the more lives we save." Grace was assigned to one of the surgical tents, along with Eddie and 2 other nurses. Their first day was a baptism by fire. American infantry was pushing across the Rhine under heavy German resistance, and the casualties came in waves. Grace worked with mechanical precision. assisting surgeons as they fought to save lives one soldier at a time. The work was brutal, exhausting, and absolutely necessary. She met soldiers who'd been wounded crossing the river, who'd taken German fire while clinging to assault boats in the freezing water. She met tank crews who'd been burned when their Shermans were hit by German anti-tank fire. She met paratroopers and engineers, artillerymen and riflemen, all of them bearing wounds that would have been death sentences without immediate surgical intervention. And she saved them. Not all of them. Some wounds were simply too severe, some men too far gone by the time they reached the surgical tent. But she saved more than she lost, and that had to count for something. One evening, as she was cleaning instruments between surgical cases, a familiar voice called her name. Grace looked up to see Captain Brian Foster, now a major, standing in the entrance to the tent. He looked older than when she'd last seen him, harder around the edges, but his smile was genuine. "Lieutenant, sorry, Captain Mercer," Foster said. "I heard you were assigned to this unit. Had to come see for myself, if it was true." "Major Foster," Grace replied, setting down the instruments to shake his hand. "Last I heard, you were somewhere in Belgium." "Was. My battalion got transferred to the 3rd Army for the Rhine crossing. We're staging for the push into the German interior." Foster glanced around the surgical tent, taking in the blood-stained tables, the organized chaos. "Still running toward the danger instead of away from it, I see." "Someone has to," Grace said simply. They talked for a few minutes, trading stories about the month since the farmhouse, about mutual acquaintances and the progress of the war. Foster told her that Danny Kowalski had written to him, that the kid was safely home in Pittsburgh, working in his uncle's steel mill. He told her about the crossing of the Rhine, about the desperate German resistance, and the sense that despite everything, the Wehrmacht was finally breaking. "We're winning," Foster said quietly. "It doesn't always feel like it, but we are. Every day we push deeper into Germany, every town we liberate, every prisoner camp we find. It's all adding up to something." "I hope you're right," Grace said. "I am right," Foster replied with certainty. "And when this war finally ends, when we can all go home, I'm going to find the finest restaurant in Philadelphia and buy you the best steak dinner money can buy. It's a promise." Grace smiled. "I'll hold you to that, Major." Foster left with his characteristic efficiency, and Grace returned to her work, but his words stayed with her. The idea that they were building towards something, that all this suffering had a purpose beyond itself. She wanted to believe that. Needed to believe it, really, because the alternative was to accept that all the death and destruction was meaningless, random, a cosmic joke with no punchline. As March turned to April, the American forces pushed deeper into Germany, encountering increasingly desperate resistance from Wehrmacht units and SS fanatics who refused to accept that their cause was lost. The forward surgical unit moved every few days, following the advancing army, always staying as close to the fighting as safety would allow. Grace saw the dark heart of Nazi Germany during those weeks, the concentration camps that Allied forces were liberating, the prisoners who were barely alive, the evidence of atrocities that exceeded anything she'd imagined human beings capable of. She helped treat liberated prisoners at Buchenwald, men and women who weighed less than 80 pounds, who'd survived on starvation rations and brutal labor for years. She held the hands of people who'd lost their entire families to the gas chambers, who'd witnessed horrors that no amount of medical care could heal. It changed something in her, seeing those camps. All the wounded soldiers she'd treated, all the death and suffering she'd witnessed, it all took on new meaning when she understood what they'd been fighting against. This wasn't just a war between nations. It was a war between civilization and barbarism, between humanity and something darker. Eddie felt it too. "My parents fled China because of Japanese aggression," he told Grace one night as they sat outside their tent, too exhausted to sleep. "I always understood this war in the abstract, But seeing those camps, he shook his head. Now I understand why my brother volunteered, why any of us volunteered. Some things are worth dying to stop. Some things are worth living to stop too, Grace replied. We save lives here, Eddie. That's how we fight this darkness, by preserving light wherever we can find it. In mid-April, American and Soviet forces linked up at the Elbe River, effectively cutting Germany in two. The end was clearly in sight now, though the fighting continued with undiminished ferocity. Hitler's regime was collapsing, but plenty of German soldiers were still willing to fight and die for a cause that had already lost. Grace was working on a particularly difficult case, a young sergeant who'd taken shrapnel to the abdomen during a firefight in a German town, when Colonel Harrison received word that President Roosevelt had died. The news spread through the surgical unit like wildfire, stunning everyone into momentary silence. Roosevelt had been president for so long that many of the younger soldiers couldn't remember anyone else in the White House. He'd led the nation through the Depression and most of the war, and now he was gone, dying just weeks before the victory he'd worked so hard to achieve. Grace felt the loss personally. Roosevelt's fireside chats had been a constant presence during her childhood, his voice offering reassurance during the darkest days of economic collapse. He'd seemed immortal, indestructible, and his death was a reminder that no one was immune to mortality, not even presidents. But the war didn't stop for mourning. The surgical cases kept coming, and Grace kept working, honoring Roosevelt's memory by continuing the fight he'd led. Vice President Truman was sworn in, and the American military machine continued its relentless advance into the heart of Germany. On the last day of April, as Grace was treating a soldier who'd been wounded in street fighting in Munich, word came that Hitler was dead, apparently by suicide in his bunker beneath Berlin. The news was met with grim satisfaction rather than celebration. Hitler's death didn't bring back the millions who died because of his madness, didn't undo the Holocaust or the war he'd unleashed on the world. But it did mean the end was near. German resistance began to collapse across all fronts as units surrendered en masse, unwilling to continue fighting for a cause that had died with their Führer. On May 7th, Germany officially surrendered, and the war in Europe was over. Grace heard the news while assisting in a surgery on a German soldier, one of the last casualties of the European war. The man had been shot by SS fanatics for trying to surrender to American forces, and now here he was, being saved by the very people his nation had been trying to destroy for 6 years. Colonel Harrison finished the surgery, then stepped back from the table and removed his surgical mask. "Well, that's it then. War's over. We won." WWII, the words should have brought joy, celebration, relief. Instead, Grace felt a strange emptiness, like she'd been running for so long that she didn't know how to stop. Around her, other nurses and surgeons were hugging, crying, laughing. Eddie Chen gripped her hand tightly, tears streaming down his face. "We made it, Grace. We actually made it through." Grace nodded, unable to speak around the lump in her throat. They'd made it through, but so many others hadn't. She thought of all the names in her notebook, all the final words she'd recorded, all the lives that had ended too soon. The war was over, but the cost would echo for generations. That night, the surgical unit held an impromptu celebration. Someone found a cache of German wine, and Colonel Harrison declared it officially liberated for medical morale purposes. Grace accepted a glass but barely touched it, too overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had just happened to feel much like celebrating. Major Foster found her sitting alone outside her tent, looking up at the stars. "Not in a celebrating mood?" he asked, settling down beside her. "I should be happy," Grace said quietly. "The war's over. We won. I'm going home. But all I can think about are the ones who didn't make it." "That's because you're a good person," Foster replied. "The ones who can celebrate without thinking about the cost. They're the ones you need to worry about. But people like you who carry the weight of it all." He paused. "You're the reason we won, Grace, not because of your medical skills, though those are considerable, but because you never stopped caring, never stopped fighting to preserve life, even when death was everywhere around you. That matters. That means something." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, two people who'd survived something that had broken so many others. Finally, Foster spoke again. "I still owe you that steak dinner in Philadelphia. When we get home, when all this is done, I'm going to make good on that promise." Grace smiled despite her sadness. "I'll hold you to it, Major." The journey home began in late May, after the surgical unit was officially decommissioned and its personnel reassigned to occupation duties or rotation back to the States. Grace was slated to return to America along with several thousand other nurses and medical personnel who'd served throughout the European campaign. The army was keeping some medical staff in Germany to deal with the ongoing health crisis among liberated prisoners and displaced persons, but Grace had earned her ticket home. She spent her last week in Europe visiting some of the soldiers she'd treated, men who were recovering in hospitals across the occupation zone. She found Rodriguez in a hospital in Frankfurt, his legs still healing, but his spirits high. He was planning to return to Iowa, marry his high school sweetheart, and take over his family's farm. "My dad wrote me," Rodriguez said, showing Grace the worn letter. "Says the farm's been waiting for me, and so has Maria. Says a man who can survive what I survived can handle anything farming throws at him." He gripped Grace's hand. "None of that would be possible without you, Captain. You gave me my life back." She visited Marcus Webb in Stuttgart, where he was working as a clerk, while his chest wound finished healing. He'd gotten married by proxy to his girlfriend back in Iowa, and he showed Grace the wedding photo with obvious pride. "She said she wasn't waiting another day," Marcus explained. "Said she'd already waited 2 years while I was over here, and she wasn't going to waste any more time. So we got married with me in Germany and her in Des Moines, and as soon as I get home, we're going to have a proper ceremony." He looked at Grace seriously. "I want you to be there, Captain Mercer. You're the reason I'm alive to get married at all." Grace promised she'd try to make it, though she knew the likelihood of actually getting to Iowa was slim. Still, it meant something to Marcus, and after everything they'd been through together, the least she could do was make the promise. She also tracked down Captain Brian Foster, who was now stationed in Berlin with occupation forces. They met at a cafe in what had once been a fashionable district, now reduced to rubble and slowly rebuilding. Over terrible coffee and surprisingly good pastries that the cafe owner had somehow managed to produce, they talked about what came next. "The army wants me to stay on," Foster said. "They're offering me a promotion to lieutenant colonel if I agree to remain in Germany for another year, help with the occupation and reconstruction. It's good for my career, and honestly, I think the work matters. Someone has to help put this place back together." "Are you going to do it?" Grace asked. Foster stirred his coffee thoughtfully. "I don't know. Part of me wants to go home, get back to civilian life, try to remember who I was before the war. But another part thinks that would be running away from responsibility. We broke this country. We have an obligation to help fix it." "You didn't break it," Grace said firmly. "Hitler and his followers broke it. We just stopped them from breaking the rest of the world too." "Maybe." Foster smiled slightly. "What about you? Going back to that hospital job in Omaha?" Grace had been thinking about that question for weeks. The hospital job was still there, waiting for her, just like her family was waiting in Nebraska. She could go home, slip back into civilian life, try to forget about the war and everything she'd seen. But the idea felt wrong somehow, like putting on clothes that no longer fit. "I'm thinking about staying in the Army Nurse Corps," she admitted. "Not here in Europe, but somewhere. The Pacific War is still going, and they need experienced nurses out there. And after that, when all the fighting finally stops, there's going to be so much work to do, treating wounded veterans, dealing with the psychological trauma, helping people rebuild their lives. Foster nodded slowly. That sounds like you. Running toward the hard things instead of away from them. He reached across the table and took her hand. Grace, I meant what I said about that steak dinner. When we're both finally back in the States, when this is all behind us, I want to see you again. Not as officers or comrades, but as, he paused, searching for words, as people who've been through hell together and came out the other side. Grace felt her heart skip. She'd been focused for so long on the war, on survival, on saving lives, that she'd barely thought about what might come after. But looking at Foster now, remembering the farmhouse and all the impossible days since, she realized she wanted that too. Wanted to explore whatever this connection between them might become when they weren't surrounded by death and destruction. I'd like that, she said quietly. I'd like that very much. They spent the rest of the afternoon together, walking through the ruins of Berlin, talking about everything except the war. Foster told her about his childhood in Philadelphia, about his father's church and his mother's garden, about the plans he'd had before Pearl Harbor that seemed like they belonged to a different person entirely. Grace told him about Nebraska, about endless wheat fields and summer thunderstorms, about a life that felt impossibly far away and yet still somehow real. When it was time for Grace to leave, Foster walked her to the jeep that would take her back to her quarters. I'm going to hold you to that dinner, he said, and this time I'm thinking more than just steak. I'm thinking a whole evening, maybe dancing, definitely no talk about the war. It's a date, Grace replied, and the word felt strange and wonderful on her tongue. The ship that carried Grace and several hundred other nurses back to America departed from Le Havre in early June. It was a transport vessel that had been hastily converted to carry personnel, cramped and uncomfortable, but infinitely preferable to the troop ships that had brought them to Europe years earlier. The women were giddy with relief and anticipation, talking endlessly about what they'd do when they got home, making plans that might or might not come to fruition. Eddie Chen was on the same ship, headed back to San Francisco to finish his medical degree. He found Grace on deck one evening as they crossed the Atlantic, both of them watching the sun set over water that was peaceful now, no longer filled with U-boats and danger. I got accepted back to medical school, Eddie said. They're giving me credit for my field experience, so I only have one more year before I can take my licensing exams. After that, he smiled. After that, I'm going to be the best damn surgeon in California. I'm going to save so many lives that my brother's sacrifice won't feel quite so pointless. Your brother's sacrifice was never pointless, Grace said gently. He died protecting the people he loved, the country he believed in. That matters, Eddie. It always mattered. I know, Eddie replied. I just wish he'd lived to see us win, lived to see what his death helped protect. He stood in silence for a while. Then Eddie spoke again. What are you going to do, Grace? Really? Grace had been wrestling with that question for weeks. I'm going to go home, see my family, try to remember what normal life feels like. And then I'm going to make a decision about the future. The Army wants me to stay in, and I'm leaning toward it. But first, I need to figure out who Grace Mercer is when she's not surrounded by wounded soldiers. I think you're going to find you're the same person, Eddie said. Someone who runs toward the people who need help instead of away from them. Someone who refuses to quit even when quitting would be easier. That's not going to change just because the war's over. The ship docked in New York Harbor on a brilliantly sunny morning in mid-June. Grace stood on deck with hundreds of other women, watching the Statue of Liberty grow larger as they approached, and she felt tears streaming down her face. She was home. After 3 years of war, After countless battles and more wounded soldiers than she could count, she was finally home. The city threw a parade for the returning nurses, crowds lining the streets of Manhattan, cheering and waving American flags. Grace rode in one of the trucks, overwhelmed by the celebration, by the gratitude in the faces of the people who'd sent them off to war and now welcomed them back. Signs proclaimed, "Our heroic nurses and welcome home angels of mercy," and Grace felt the weight of those expectations settling on her shoulders. After the parade, there were speeches by generals and politicians, ceremonies honoring the women who'd served, presentations of medals and commendations. Grace received her Distinguished Service Cross in a ceremony attended by hundreds of people, the medal pinned to her chest by a 3-star general who called her an inspiration to all who serve. But what mattered more than any medal was the telegram waiting for her at the hotel where the army had billeted her. "We're so proud of you. Come home soon. Love, Mom and Dad." The train journey to Nebraska took 2 days, and Grace spent most of it staring out the window at a country that looked both familiar and strange. There were victory gardens in every town, gold stars in windows marking homes that had lost sons to the war, factories still running at full capacity to support the ongoing fight against Japan. America had been transformed by the war, just like Europe had, just like Grace herself had. Her father met her at the station in Omaha, and for a moment they just stood there looking at each other. Thomas Mercer had aged in the 3 years she'd been gone, his hair grayer, his face more lined. But his eyes were the same, warm and kind, and when he finally embraced her, Grace felt something inside her begin to uncurl, some tension she'd been carrying since the day she'd shipped out. "Welcome home, honey," he whispered. "Welcome home." Her mother was waiting at the house, along with what seemed like half the town. There were neighbors and family friends, people from their church, classmates Grace hadn't seen since high school. They'd prepared a feast, fried chicken and mashed potatoes, corn on the cob, fresh-baked bread, and 3 different pies. It was more food than Grace had seen in one place since before the war, and the sheer normalcy of it all made her want to laugh and cry simultaneously. Tommy was there too, home on leave from the Navy. He'd grown up in the time she'd been gone, no longer the gangly teenager who'd lied about his age to enlist, but a confident young man who'd seen his share of action in the Pacific. They embraced carefully, both of them understanding that they'd been changed by experiences the other couldn't fully comprehend. The celebration lasted late into the night, people asking Grace questions about Europe, about the war, about what she'd done and seen. She answered as best she could, editing out the worst parts, focusing on stories of courage and survival rather than death and destruction. They wanted to hear about heroism, not horror, and Grace did her best to give them what they needed. But later, after everyone had gone home and the house was quiet, Grace sat with her parents at the kitchen table and told them the truth. She told them about the farmhouse, about holding dying men in her arms, about the concentration camps and the sheer scale of human suffering she'd witnessed. She told them about the choices she'd had to make, about the people she'd saved and the ones she'd lost. Her mother wept openly, and her father gripped Grace's hand so tightly it hurt. But they listened to all of it, bearing witness to her story the way she'd borne witness to so many others. "I'm so sorry you had to see those things," her mother said when Grace finished. "So sorry you had to carry that burden." "Someone had to," Grace replied simply. "And I'm glad it was me because I know I helped people. I saved lives, Mom, a lot of lives. That has to count for something." "It counts for everything," her father said firmly. "You did what needed doing, and you did it with honor and courage. We couldn't be more proud of you." Grace spent the next few weeks trying to readjust to civilian life. She helped her mother in the garden, went to church socials, visited with old friends who wanted to hear about her adventures. But she felt disconnected from it all, like she was watching her old life from behind glass. The rhythms of small-town Nebraska that had once been so familiar now felt alien and confining. She also struggled with silence. After years of constant noise, gunfire, explosions, the cries of wounded men, the quiet of rural Nebraska was almost oppressive. She found herself waking at night in a panic, convinced she'd heard artillery fire, only to realize it was just a thunderstorm or a car backfiring. Tommy noticed her struggle. One evening they sat together on the porch, watching fireflies dance across the yard, and he spoke quietly. "It's different for us now, isn't it? We can't go back to who we were before." Grace nodded. "I keep trying to fit back into my old life, but it's like putting on a coat that's too small. Nothing fits right anymore." "I feel the same way," Tommy admitted. "The Navy wants me to re-enlist, and I'm thinking about doing it. Out in the Pacific, I knew who I was, what I was supposed to do. Here," he gestured at the peaceful Nebraska landscape. "Here, I feel lost." "What are you going to do?" Grace asked. "Probably re-enlist, finish my service, see the war through to the end." "After that," he shrugged. "After that, I'll figure it out. What about you?" Grace had been thinking about that question constantly. The Army had offered her a permanent commission as a captain with assignment to Walter Reed Hospital in Washington, D.C. It was a prestigious position, a chance to work with the best medical professionals in the country, treating wounded veterans who needed ongoing care. It would mean staying in the military, committing to a career she'd stumbled into almost by accident. But it would also mean continuing to do the work that mattered, helping people who needed help, using the skills she'd developed through years of combat nursing. And honestly, Grace couldn't imagine doing anything else. The hospital job in Omaha held no appeal anymore. She'd seen too much, done too much to be satisfied with routine medical work. "I'm going to accept the Army's commission," she said aloud, the decision crystallizing as she spoke. "I'm going to Walter Reed, and I'm going to help wounded veterans rebuild their lives." Tommy smiled. "That sounds right for you. You were always the one who ran toward the people who needed help." In early August, Grace received a telegram from Brian Foster. He'd decided to stay in Germany for another year, working with occupation forces, but he wanted to know if she'd be willing to correspond while he was overseas. "I meant what I said about that dinner," the telegram read. "When I finally make it back to the States, I want to see you. If you're interested, write me. If not, I understand. Either way, thank you for everything you did during the war. You saved my life in ways that have nothing to do with medicine. Brian." Grace read the telegram 3 times, then sat down and wrote a letter. She told Foster about coming home, about the struggle to readjust, about her decision to accept the commission at Walter Reed. She told him she'd be happy to correspond, that she'd enjoyed their conversations in Berlin, that she was looking forward to that promised dinner whenever he finally made it home. She mailed the letter the next day, and 3 weeks later received a response. Foster wrote about his work in Germany, about the challenges of occupation, about the slow process of helping a broken nation rebuild. But he also wrote about personal things, books he was reading, places he wanted to visit when he finally had leave, questions about Grace's life and experiences. It was the beginning of a correspondence that would continue for months, letters crossing the Atlantic carrying pieces of 2 lives, slowly finding their way back to normalcy. On August 15th, Japan surrendered, and the war was finally, definitively over. Grace heard the news on the radio in her parents' kitchen, and this time she did cry, great heaving sobs of relief and grief and exhaustion. It was done. After 6 years of global conflict, after millions of deaths and unimaginable destruction, it was finally done. Nebraska celebrated with all-night parties, church bells ringing, people dancing in the streets. Grace joined the celebration, letting herself feel joy for the first time in what felt like years. Tommy was safe now, wouldn't have to invade Japan. All the soldiers she'd treated, all the lives she'd saved, they'd have a chance at futures that only hours before had been desperately uncertain. But even in the midst of celebration, Grace thought about the cost. She thought about the names in her notebook, about all the men who died before reaching this moment. She thought about the concentration camp survivors, about the cities reduced to rubble, about all the scars, physical and psychological, that would take generations to heal. The next morning, Grace made her final decision. She accepted the commission at Walter Reed, packed her belongings, and prepared to leave Nebraska. Her parents understood, though her mother cried, and her father looked like he wanted to. "You're doing important work," Thomas Mercer said as he drove Grace to the train station. "Those veterans need someone who understands what they've been through, and you're one of the few people who truly does. But Grace," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "don't forget to live your own life too. Don't spend so much time helping others that you forget to be happy yourself." "I'll try, Dad," Grace promised. Walter Reed Hospital in Washington, D.C. was a sprawling complex dedicated to treating military personnel, and when Grace arrived in late August, it was overflowing with wounded veterans from both theaters of war. Men with amputated limbs, blinded soldiers, burn victims, and countless others suffering from what the doctors were beginning to call combat fatigue. The psychological wounds that were often harder to treat than physical injuries. Grace was assigned to Ward 7, which specialized in treating soldiers with severe wounds requiring long-term rehabilitation. Her first patient was a sergeant named William Harrison, who'd lost both legs to a landmine in France and was struggling with depression and anger at his situation. "I'm 23 years old," Harrison told Grace bitterly during their first conversation. "I'm never going to walk again, never going to play baseball with my kid, never going to dance at my sister's wedding. My life is over." Grace pulled up a chair and sat beside his bed. "Your life isn't over, Sergeant. It's different now, yes, harder, absolutely, but it's not over. I've seen men with injuries like yours go on to do amazing things. One of the soldiers I treated in Europe lost both legs and became a farmer. Another became a teacher. Your life isn't defined by what you've lost. It's defined by what you choose to do with what you have left." Harrison looked skeptical, but over the following weeks, Grace worked with him patiently, encouraging him through physical therapy, celebrating small victories, refusing to let him give up. She introduced him to other amputees who were further along in their recovery, men who were learning to walk with prosthetics, who were planning futures beyond their injuries. Slowly, Harrison began to heal, not just physically, but emotionally. Grace watched him transform from an angry, defeated young man into someone who was beginning to hope again, to believe that his life still had value and purpose. She saw similar transformations across Ward 7. There was Private Jacob Morrison, blinded by a grenade in the Pacific, who was learning Braille and planning to become a teacher for blind children. There was Corporal David Chen, another Chen, the third one Grace had known during the war, who'd lost his right arm and was teaching himself to paint with his left hand, creating stunning landscapes from memory. Grace worked with each of them, using skills she'd learned during the war, but also something deeper, an understanding of trauma and resilience, a refusal to accept that wounds had to define futures. She pushed her patients when they needed pushing, comforted them when they needed comfort, and believed in them when they'd lost the ability to believe in themselves. The work was hard, but profoundly meaningful. Grace found herself more fulfilled at Walter Reed than she'd ever been in Europe, because here she could see the long-term results of her care. She could watch men rebuild their lives, see them leave the hospital to return to families and careers and futures they'd thought were lost. In October, she received a letter from Brian Foster. He was coming home for Christmas, rotating back to the States after his year in Germany. "I haven't forgotten about that dinner I promised you," he wrote. "In fact, I've spent the better part of 6 months planning it. I hope you're ready for the best steak in Philadelphia, followed by dancing and absolutely no discussion of the war. What do you say, Grace? Are you free the week of Christmas?" Grace wrote back immediately, "I'm free, and I'm looking forward to it more than you know." As the weeks passed, Grace found herself thinking more and more about Foster, about the connection they'd formed during the darkest days of the war. She'd been focused for so long on survival and duty that she'd barely thought about romance or personal happiness. But now, with the war over and her life beginning to take shape again, she allowed herself to consider possibilities she'd suppressed for years. Christmas arrived cold and bright. Grace took leave from Walter Reed and traveled to Philadelphia, where Foster had reserved a table at one of the city's finest restaurants. When she saw him waiting for her at the restaurant entrance, wearing a civilian suit instead of his uniform, she almost didn't recognize him. He looked younger, lighter, like some weight had been lifted from his shoulders. "Captain Mercer," he said with a smile. "Or should I say just Grace now that we're not on duty?" "Just Grace," she replied. "And you're just Brian?" "Just Brian," he confirmed. The dinner was everything he'd promised. Perfectly cooked steaks, good wine, conversation that ranged from books to music to plans for the future. They didn't talk about the war, keeping the promise Foster had made months earlier. Instead, they talked about who they were becoming now that the fighting was done, about the lives they were building from the ashes of their wartime experiences. After dinner, they walked through the city, Philadelphia decorated for Christmas with lights and garlands. Foster took her hand at some point, and Grace didn't pull away. It felt natural, right? Like the culmination of something that had been building since that frozen farmhouse in the Ardennes. "I've been thinking about you constantly," Foster admitted as they walked. "During the occupation, during the long meetings and administrative work, I'd think about you and wonder if we'd get this chance. If we could be more than just war buddies." "I've been thinking about you too," Grace said quietly, wondering if what we felt in Belgium was real or just the intensity of combat bringing us together. "And?" Foster asked. "What do you think now?" Grace stopped walking and turned to face him. "I think it was real then, and it's real now. I think we went through something together that most people can't understand, and that created a bond that's worth exploring." Foster smiled, and in that moment, Grace saw not the hardened combat officer, but the man underneath, someone who'd survived hell and was trying to figure out how to live in peacetime, just like she was. They spent the rest of Grace's leave together, exploring Philadelphia, attending concerts, talking for hours about everything and nothing. When it was time for Grace to return to Walter Reed, Foster rode with her to the train station. "I'm staying in Philadelphia," he said. "The Army offered me a desk job at the Pentagon, but I turned it down. I'm going back to school, getting my degree, maybe becoming a teacher like my father wanted. But Grace," he took her hands, "I want to see you again. As often as possible, I want to see where this goes." "So do I," Grace said. "So do I." They began a courtship conducted through letters and occasional visits, slowly building a relationship in peacetime that had started in war. Foster came to Washington once a month, and Grace traveled to Philadelphia when she could get leave. They went to museums and concerts, had long dinners and longer conversations, and gradually fell in love with each other outside the context of combat and crisis. At Walter Reed, Grace continued her work with wounded veterans. She was promoted to major in the spring of 1946, given more administrative responsibilities, but she insisted on maintaining direct patient care. The work mattered too much to give it up for a desk job. She also began writing, first just journal entries, trying to process everything she'd experienced during the war, but gradually expanding into something more substantial. She wrote about the farmhouse, about the soldiers she'd treated, about the cost of war and the resilience of the human spirit. Her commanding officer read some of her writing and encouraged her to submit it for publication. In the summer of 1946, Grace's first article appeared in a military medical journal, a piece about treating combat trauma that drew on her experiences in Europe. More articles followed, and Grace found she had a talent for translating her experiences into words that helped other medical professionals understand the unique challenges of combat nursing. Eddie Chen wrote to her regularly from San Francisco, where he'd finished medical school and was doing his surgical residency at a major hospital. He was engaged to be married to a nurse he'd met during his training, and he credited Grace with inspiring him to pursue medicine despite the trauma of what they'd witnessed during the war. "You taught me that we can carry the weight of terrible experiences without being crushed by them," Eddie wrote, "that we can transform our pain into purpose, our suffering into service. I'm going to spend my career saving lives, and every time I step into an operating room, I'm going to remember what you taught me about refusing to give up on people." In December 1946, Brian Foster proposed to Grace during one of his visits to Washington. They were walking through Rock Creek Park, the first snow of winter falling around them, when he stopped and pulled out a simple gold ring. "I know we've only been courting for a year," Foster said. "But I've known you for 2 years, and I've loved you for at least that long. Grace Mercer, will you marry me?" Grace looked at the ring, at Foster's hopeful face, and felt the last piece of her life click into place. "Yes," she said. "Yes, absolutely yes." They were married in the spring of 1947 in a small ceremony at her parents' church in Nebraska. Tommy was there, having re-enlisted in the Navy and now a petty officer. Eddie Chen came all the way from California, bringing his new wife. Several of Grace's patients from Walter Reed attended, men she'd helped through their darkest moments and who insisted on being there for her happiest day. Danny Kowalski sent a telegram. "Told you I'd name my daughter after you. Grace Kowalski was born last week. Thank you for everything. Wishing you all happiness." Rodriguez wrote from Iowa. "Married Maria last month. Farm's doing well. Never forget what you did for us. Congratulations on your wedding." The ceremony was simple but perfect. Grace in a modest white dress, Foster in his dress uniform. As they exchanged vows, Grace thought about the long journey that had brought them to this moment. From that frozen farmhouse in Belgium to this peaceful Nebraska church. From war to peace, from survival to love. After the wedding, they honeymooned in Colorado, spending 2 weeks in the mountains far from hospitals and military bases. They hiked and talked and made plans for the future. Foster had finished his degree and gotten a job teaching history at a Philadelphia high school. Grace had been offered a position as chief nurse at a veterans' hospital in Pennsylvania, which would allow them to live together. "Are you going to miss Walter Reed?" Foster asked one evening, as they watched the sunset from their cabin. "I'll miss the patients," Grace admitted. "But the work will be the same, helping wounded veterans rebuild their lives. And this time, I'll get to come home to you every night." Foster smiled. "I like the sound of that. Coming home to each other, building a life together. After everything we've been through, we've earned some happiness." They moved to Pennsylvania in the fall of 1947, settling into a small house near Foster's school. Grace threw herself into her new position, implementing programs to help veterans with both physical and psychological wounds. She brought the lessons she'd learned during the war, that trauma could be survived, that wounds didn't have to define futures, that with the right support, people could rebuild their lives after unimaginable loss. She also continued writing, publishing articles, and eventually a book about combat nursing that became required reading for military medical training. The book was honest about the horrors of war, but also hopeful about human resilience, and it resonated with veterans and medical professionals alike. In 1949, Grace gave birth to their first child, a daughter they named Margaret, after Foster's mother. Holding her daughter for the first time, Grace felt a profound sense of hope. This child would grow up in a world at peace, would never have to experience the horrors that had defined her parents' early adulthood. That meant something. That meant all the suffering hadn't been in vain. A son followed 2 years later, named Thomas after Grace's father. The house filled with the sounds of children, with laughter and crying and all the normal chaos of family life. Foster taught at his school during the day and came home to dinner with his family every evening. Grace worked part-time at the Veterans Hospital, balancing her career with motherhood, finding fulfillment in both. But she never forgot the war, never forgot the men she'd treated and the ones she'd lost. Every year on the anniversary of the farmhouse siege, she took out her notebook with all the names of soldiers who died in her care. She read through them, remembering each face, each final word, each life cut short. It was her way of honoring them, of ensuring their sacrifices weren't forgotten. Tommy visited regularly, having made the Navy his career. He'd married a woman from California and had children of his own. He and Grace would sit up late sometimes, talking about the war in ways they couldn't with anyone else, sharing the burden of memories that civilians couldn't fully understand. Eddie Chen became one of the leading surgeons in California, pioneering new techniques for trauma surgery based on what he'd learned during the war. He and Grace corresponded regularly, exchanging ideas about treating veterans and processing their shared experiences. He visited Philadelphia once, bringing his wife and 3 children, and he and Grace spent hours reminiscing about their time in Europe. "Do you ever regret it?" Eddie asked during that visit. "Volunteering for combat duty, seeing everything we saw." Grace thought about the question seriously. "I regret the suffering," she said finally. "I regret every death, every injury I couldn't prevent. But I don't regret serving. We made a difference, Eddie. We saved lives. That has to count for something." "It counts for everything," Eddie replied, echoing words Grace had spoken to him years earlier. In 1954, Grace was invited to speak at a conference on combat medicine, sharing her experiences from the war with a new generation of military medical professionals. Standing at the podium, looking out at an audience of young nurses and doctors, she felt the weight of responsibility. These people would face their own wars, their own impossible situations, and she needed to prepare them as best she could. "What I learned during the war," Grace told them, "is that our job as medical professionals isn't just about treating wounds. It's about preserving hope. When soldiers are at their lowest, when they've lost limbs or comrades or their sense of purpose, we're the ones who remind them that life is still worth living. That's not a medical skill you can learn from a textbook. It's something that comes from the heart, from a refusal to give up on people, even when they've given up on themselves." She spoke about the farmhouse, about holding that position with limited supplies and overwhelming odds. She spoke about the dying tent, about bearing witness to final moments. She spoke about Walter Reed and the Veterans Hospital, about watching broken men rebuild their lives with determination and courage. "You're going to see terrible things," Grace concluded. "You're going to face situations where there are no good options, only impossible choices. But remember this, every life you save matters. Every moment of comfort you provide matters. Every time you refuse to quit on a patient, you're making a difference that ripples out into the world in ways you can't imagine." The soldiers I treated during the war went on to become fathers and teachers, farmers and factory workers, artists and entrepreneurs. I helped give them that chance, and you can do the same for the people you'll treat. That's the privilege and responsibility of our profession. The speech was met with a standing ovation, and afterward, several young nurses approached Grace to thank her and ask questions. One of them, a lieutenant barely older than Grace had been when she'd shipped out to Europe, asked the question that always came up, "Weren't you afraid?" "Terrified," Grace admitted, "every single day. But fear didn't stop me from doing my job, and it shouldn't stop you from doing yours." Courage isn't the absence of fear, it's choosing to do the right thing despite the fear. Over the years, Grace maintained contact with many of the soldiers she'd treated. Christmas cards arrived from Danny Kowalski, updating her on his growing family. 3 daughters now, the eldest named Grace as promised. Rodriguez wrote periodically from Iowa, where his farm was prospering, and his children were learning to work the land. Marcus Webb sent photos of his family, 4 kids who'd never known war and never would if their father had anything to say about it. Each card, each letter, each update was a reminder that Grace's service had mattered, that the lives she'd saved had gone on to touch other lives in countless ways. It was the most profound reward she could imagine. In 1964, on the 20th anniversary of the farmhouse siege, a group of veterans who'd been there organized a reunion in Belgium. Grace and Foster traveled to Europe for the first time since the war, bringing their teenage children to see where their parents had met and fallen in love. The farmhouse was still standing, converted now into a small museum dedicated to the battle. A plaque on the wall listed the names of everyone who'd defended it, including Grace's. She stood in the courtyard where she'd once worked frantically to save lives, where German artillery had pounded their position, and felt the ghosts of memory all around her. Danny Kowalski was there, middle-aged now but still recognizable. They embraced, both crying, and Danny introduced Grace to his daughters, Grace, Margaret, and Sarah, all of them healthy and beautiful. "You gave me this," Danny said, gesturing at his family. "Without you, none of this would exist." I think about that every single day. Rodriguez came from Iowa with his wife and children. Matthews was there, his arm fully healed, working as a police officer in New York. A dozen other veterans attended, men who'd been in the farmhouse or the relief force that had broken the siege. They shared stories, laughed about things that hadn't been funny at the time, and remembered the ones who hadn't made it home. Foster gave a speech at the museum dedication, talking about the battle and its significance. But mostly, he talked about the people who'd been there, about the ordinary Americans who'd done extraordinary things when circumstances demanded it. "My wife saved my life that day," Foster said, looking at Grace, "not because she performed some dramatic medical procedure, but because she refused to give up. She taught all of us what it meant to stand firm in the face of impossible odds, to fight for every life, even when the fighting seemed hopeless. I'm not the only person she saved." He gestured at the assembled veterans. "We're all here because of her courage and dedication. Our children exist because of her. Our futures were made possible by her refusal to quit. That's worth remembering. That's worth celebrating." The reunion lasted 3 days, and Grace treasured every moment. She got to see what had become of the men she'd treated, got to meet their families, got to understand the full impact of what they'd all accomplished together. It wasn't just about that one battle in December 1944. It was about all the decades of life that had followed, all the children born and careers built and dreams pursued, because a small group of Americans had held a farmhouse in Belgium when holding it seemed impossible. On their last day in Europe, Grace and Foster returned to the farmhouse alone. They walked through the rooms, now clean and preserved, so different from the blood-soaked chaos she remembered. They stood in what had been the dying tent, where Grace had held so many hands in final moments. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we'd evacuated?" Foster asked. "If Hayes had gotten his way?" "All the time," Grace admitted. "Most of those men wouldn't have survived the journey. We'd have lost them all, but more than that, She paused, searching for words. If we'd run, if we'd abandoned our principles when things got hard, I think it would have broken something fundamental in us. We'd have survived, but we wouldn't have been able to live with ourselves. Foster nodded slowly. You were right to stand your ground. You were right about everything. They returned to America with a renewed sense of purpose. Grace threw herself back into her work at the Veterans Hospital, using the lessons from the reunion to inform her treatment of a new generation of wounded soldiers, men coming back from Korea and now Vietnam, facing their own traumas and struggles. The work never ended. There were always more wounded veterans, always more people who needed help rebuilding their lives. But Grace never tired of it, never lost her sense of purpose. Every life saved, every soldier helped back to health, every family reunited, it all mattered. In her later years, Grace became an advocate for veterans' health care, testifying before Congress about the need for better mental health services and long-term care. She used her status as a war hero, though she hated that term, to push for policies that would help veterans transition back to civilian life. These men and women gave everything for their country, Grace told a congressional committee in 1972. The least we can do is ensure they get the care they need when they come home. We can't bring back the dead, but we can honor their sacrifice by taking care of the living. Her testimony, combined with growing public awareness of veterans' issues, helped pass legislation expanding veterans' health care and establishing new programs for treating post-traumatic stress disorder. It was Grace's way of continuing to serve, of ensuring that the lessons learned from her generation's war benefited future generations of soldiers. Foster retired from teaching in 1975, and he and Grace spent more time traveling, visiting the children. Margaret was now a doctor, Thomas a teacher like his father, and their grandchildren. They returned to Europe several times, visiting battlefields and cemeteries, paying respects to the ones who hadn't made it home. Each visit was bittersweet, remembering the horror of war while celebrating the peace that had followed, mourning the lost while honoring the survivors. Grace always brought flowers to the American cemetery at Ardennes, placing them on graves of soldiers whose names were in her notebook, men she'd tried and failed to save. They're not forgotten, she'd whisper at each grave. I remember you. I'll always remember you. In 1984, on the 40th anniversary of the Ardennes battle, Grace was invited to give a keynote speech at a major veterans conference. She was 70 years old now, her hair grey, her hands showing the arthritis that came with age. But her voice was still strong as she addressed an auditorium full of veterans from multiple wars. I've spent 40 years thinking about the lessons of that winter in Belgium, Grace said. About what it taught me about courage, about duty, about the best and worst of human nature, and I've come to believe that the most important lesson is this. We are at our best when we refuse to abandon each other, when we stand together in the face of impossible odds, when we fight for every life, every person, every chance at a future. The war taught me that humans are capable of unimaginable cruelty, yes, but it also taught me that we're capable of extraordinary compassion, that in our darkest moments we can find the strength to help each other, to sacrifice for each other, to become better than we ever thought possible. That's what I want you to remember from my generation's war. Not just the battles we fought or the enemies we defeated, but the bonds we formed, the lives we saved, the principles we refused to compromise. We proved that ordinary people, when faced with extraordinary circumstances, can do remarkable things. And that's a lesson that never gets old, no matter how many years pass or how much the world changes. The speech received another standing ovation, and Grace was surrounded afterward by veterans wanting to share their own stories, to thank her for her service, to tell her how much her example had meant to them. She listened to each one, giving them the same attention and respect she'd given to wounded soldiers 60 years earlier. That night, back in their hotel room, Foster held Grace close. "You're still doing it," he said with quiet admiration. "Still running toward the people who need help. Still refusing to quit." "It's the only way I know how to be," Grace replied. "The war taught me what I was capable of, and I've spent the rest of my life trying to live up to that. To honor the memory of everyone who didn't make it home by making the most of the life I was lucky enough to keep living." Grace Mercer passed away in 1995 at the age of 81, surrounded by her family. Her funeral was attended by hundreds of people. Former patients, fellow nurses, veterans from multiple wars, politicians and military officers who'd been influenced by her advocacy work. Danny Kowalski flew in from Pittsburgh, elderly now, but still carrying himself with the strength she remembered. Rodriguez came from Iowa, walking with a cane, but walking nonetheless. Eddie Chen flew from California, his surgical career legendary, his impact on trauma medicine incalculable. They buried her at Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors, her Distinguished Service Cross and other medals displayed on her coffin. As the honor guard fired their salute and a bugler played taps, Foster stood with their children and grandchildren, surrounded by the legacy Grace had built, not just in the lives she'd directly saved, but in all the lives those people had touched, all the generations that existed because one nurse had refused to abandon her patients in a frozen Belgian farmhouse. Tommy delivered the eulogy, his voice thick with emotion as he spoke about his sister. "Grace taught me that courage isn't about being unafraid. It's about being terrified and doing the right thing anyway. She taught me that one person, refusing to quit, refusing to compromise their principles, can make a difference that echoes through generations. She saved countless lives during the war, but more than that, she showed us all what it means to truly serve others, to put their needs above your own, to fight for every person's right to a future. The world is better because Grace Mercer was in it. Families exist because she refused to let their fathers and sons die. Children were born because she kept their grandfathers alive. Entire communities were shaped by the men she saved and sent home to build lives and raise families and contribute to society. That's her legacy. Not just the medals or the honors, but all those ripples of impact spreading out through time. After the funeral, the veterans who'd known Grace gathered to share stories. Danny Kowalski talked about naming his daughter after her. Rodriguez spoke about how Grace had given him back his life, had refused to let him die in that frozen farmhouse. Matthews remembered her courage under fire, the way she'd worked calmly while bullets cracked overhead and artillery pounded their position. Eddie Chen told about learning everything important from Grace, not just medical techniques, but how to carry the weight of tragedy without being crushed, how to transform suffering into service, how to keep fighting for people even when fighting seemed hopeless. "She saved my life," Danny said, and a dozen other voices echoed, "She saved mine too." Foster listened to them all, these men whose lives had been touched by Grace's courage and compassion, and he felt profound gratitude that he'd gotten to spend 50 years with such a remarkable person. Grace had been his wife, his partner, the mother of his children, but she'd also been something more, a reminder of what humans could be at their best, of the good that one person could do if they refused to accept that the darkness had won. In the years after Grace's death, her story became part of military medical training, used to teach new generations of nurses and doctors about courage under fire and the importance of never giving up on patients. The farmhouse in Belgium was expanded into a larger museum, with an entire section dedicated to Grace and the other medical personnel who'd served there. Schools and hospitals were named after her. Her book on combat nursing remained required reading. The real legacy was in the lives she'd touched, not just the soldiers she'd treated, but their children and grandchildren, all the people who existed because Grace Mercer had refused to abandon wounded men in a Belgian farmhouse 70 years earlier. Those ripples continued spreading, touching new lives, creating new possibilities, proving that one person's courage could indeed change the world. On the 50th anniversary of the farmhouse siege in December 1994, just months before Grace's death, a journalist had asked her if she had any regrets about her service during the war. Grace had thought about the question for a long moment before answering. "I regret every death I witnessed," she'd said finally, "every soldier I couldn't save, every family that lost someone they loved. I carry those losses with me every day, but I don't regret serving. I don't regret choosing to stay at that farmhouse instead of evacuating. I don't regret any of the hard choices I made, because I made them trying to preserve life, trying to give people a chance at a future. That's all any of us can do. Make the best choices we can with the information we have and trust that doing the right thing matters even when we can't see the full impact of our actions." Those words, preserved in that final interview, became her epitaph, not carved in stone, but carried forward by everyone whose life she'd touched. They were a reminder that courage mattered, that principle mattered, that one person refusing to quit could make a difference that echoed through generations. Grace Mercer had been an ordinary nurse from Nebraska who'd found herself in extraordinary circumstances. She'd faced impossible odds and refused to surrender. She'd held dying men in her arms and kept living men alive. She'd fought with compassion instead of weapons, and she'd won victories that lasted far longer than any military conquest. And when her time finally came, when she could finally rest after decades of service, she left behind a world that was immeasurably better because she'd been in it. Not because of anything grand or dramatic, but because she'd simply refused to give up on people who needed help. That was Grace Mercer's legacy. That was her gift to the world, and it was a gift that would keep on giving generation after generation, as long as people remembered that courage, compassion, and an unwillingness to quit could change everything.